Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Royal Society. This is a high jump for science, and this evening's panel discussion is all going to be all about science and technology in sport. This whole event is the Summer Science Exhibition at the Royal Society. It's the biggest event we have here at the Royal Society. It's open to everybody who's to come along. And it's looking at all the latest research and advances in science and technology from across all disciplines of science. Before we start, I do have to go over a few formalities. The event is being recorded, so please could we have all mobile phones switched off? Also, fire exits in case something does go horrendously wrong. There's one over there, and there's one over there, but just in case, follow someone in a yellow t-shirt. They should know where they're going. So the aim of tonight is it's a discussion. We've joined here with me today. I've got 3 experts who are all working across different areas of science and technology in sport. But before I introduce them properly, we've got the London Olympics coming up in a couple of weeks, and sports science it's a relatively young area of science. So compared to things like astronomy and medicine, for over the last few years there has been a big drive in the pursuit for excellence for athletes. So we thought it would be a very topical thing to talk about now that we've got the Olympics coming up. How I was involved in sport, I was an athlete myself. As a teenager, I swam for England, Wales, and Great Britain. Kept me out of trouble and in the pool, so kept my parents pretty happy. So I was exposed to quite a lot of the science and technology that they used for the swimmers back in 2006. We had a lot of excitement about new swimsuits, the shark skins that were coming out at the time. And we a lot of when you move up into the more elite sort of groups of athletes, you get a lot more of the sort of the medical attention and the training and I've forgotten the word, and the screening that comes with it. So these are all things that are involved in sports and athletics. So as it is a discussion, I'd like you all hopefully have plenty of questions, and we want you to stimulate some discussion with our panelists here this evening. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Steve Haake, Dr. Vicky Tolfrey, and Professor Sanjay Sharma, who will be, first they'll start off with each giving a 5 to 10 minute lecture or presentation about a little bit about the background of what they do in the field, and then after that we will have a half an hour discussion about different areas in science and technology, and then we will open the questions up to you guys. So to formally introduce Steve Haake, he is the director of the Centre of Sports Engineering Research at Sheffield Hallam University, and he has set up the International Sports Engineering Association, Journal of Sports Engineering, and the International Conference on the Engineering of Sport. Apologies that I'm reading this off the screen, but it's far too much to remember to talk about. He is also he is a member of the Technical Commission for the International Tennis Federation as well, advising about the design of tennis equipment, and he is also going to be promoting the public's understanding of science during the London 2012 Olympics. Dr. Vicky Tolfrey, she is an expert in disability sports science, focusing mostly on wheelchair technology. She is a reader in applied disability sport and director of the Peter Harrison Centre for Disability Sport at Loughborough University. She is She went on to work with the Great Britain men's wheelchair basketball team for 4 years, and she has worked with Paralympians at Athens 2012, Sydney, and has attended the Atlanta Games as well. Professor Sanjay Sharma, he works at the CRY Inherited Cardiac Disease and Sport Cardiology Clinic. He is the medical director for the Virgin London Marathon, and his interests are mostly in cardiovascular adaptation for the athletes, focusing mostly on sudden death during training and exercise. So to start things off, Steve, yep, okay. After you.
Right, let me just make my way over here. Right, can we just have the front lights down a little bit, if that's possible? So thank you for that introduction. So my name's Steve Haake. I'm from Sheffield Hallam University. As Julie said, I'm director of the Centre for Sports Engineering Research. So what I thought I'd do today is perhaps just give you a little bit of an overview of where sports engineering sits in the world of sport and how sports adapt to the use of technologies. And really for that, you've got to go right back to the beginning of sport. Here we've got some Greek Olympians. So these pictures are off vases. They're at the British Museum, which is, do you know, I don't know which direction it is from here, underneath here, but it's very close to here. So go to the British Museum, you can see a lot of these pictures there. So we started off with the Stad, which was just basically a 200-meter dash about the length of a stadium, which hence the term. And obviously very little in the way of technology present there. But they did have probably the first piece of technology introduced, which is the starting blocks. So here you see these two grooves in a sill, and you put your toes in those grooves, and you started from there. If there was a false start, you had a slave behind you who would whip you to stop you from doing it again. So that was the technology of the day. So moving on rapidly, in terms of Olympics terms, it's not that rapidly, it's hundreds of years. But after hundreds of years, we have some other events starting to appear. And if you look at the picture on the left, there's a man jumping. Looks like he's holding a couple of handbags. They're not handbags. They're actually weights. They're called halteres. Again, you can see some of these in the British Museum. And what you do is you throw those weights out in front of you to give you a little bit of extra momentum when you're jumping. And allegedly, it gives you some extra distance. Someone did a calculation on this and worked out it was about 17 centimeters extra distance if you hold these rock-like handbags. On the right-hand side, you can see the guy holding some of those halteres, and you've got someone with a discus, and then you've got someone throwing a javelin. You can't see on that picture from where you are, but there's a thong wrapped round that javelin, which allowed the thrower to whip the javelin, but also unraveled the javelin, so it rotated during flight. And that's one of the key principles of things flying through the air, is if you apply a little bit of spin to it, it makes it more stable in flight. So very, very early on, as soon as technology starts to appear in terms of equipment, people start to think about how can we adapt those things. If we shoot forward approximately 2,000 years into the Victorian era, into the Industrial Revolution, you see some things starting to appear. And this is where the modern take on technology in sport becomes a little bit confused, because it is the technology that creates the sport, or is it the sport that creates the technology? So you take the simple lawnmower there, which is in the Science Museum, quite close, pretty boring piece of equipment, but actually designed primarily to create lawns for croquet and lawns for lawn tennis. So that was the major reason for the development of that lawnmower. In the 1850s, you had the invention, the vulcanization of rubber. So you had Goodyear, Hancock, et al., all fighting out for the patent for the vulcanization of rubber. But what they saw very immediately was the fact that you could use those new materials for sports balls. And hence was invented lawn tennis, football, rugby, basketball, netball. Without the invention of rubber, those sports would not have appeared. So we've got some technologies introducing new sports to us. And you can see that happens right the way through to today. Also, we have timing technology. I won't perhaps talk about that too much today. But timing technology is one of those things that has evolved over the years and, in fact, camera systems have turned into timing systems. So we've got two technologies there which have involved in sport right from very early on, cameras and timing, which have now joined together. And so when you see someone crossing the finishing line, you have a photograph to work out which is the first across the line. So in the early part of the 20th century, you see the evolution of tennis rackets from the thing on the left-hand side, which is a real tennis racket, which is an indoor game of tennis. Hampton Court has one of those. Cambridge University has one of those. Not very many of those around. In the middle, you see the Dunlop Max Ply wooden tennis rackets. There's a few young people here thinking, what the hell is that? Okay, it's a wooden racket. Yes, we did used to play with them. And on the right-hand side, we have a graphite tennis racket, which is the modern take. And you can't see that one because that was the first one that John McEnroe used. It's slightly larger than the wooden tennis racket. And the technology allowed more power into the game, but also allowed more technique into the game. And you can see at the bottom there, you've got I think that's Lottie Dodd, who was a British tennis player, and one of the Williams sisters. I'm not going to take a guess because I can never remember which one's which. And you can see that on the right-hand side, we've got this huge Wilson tennis racket, and there's certain advantages that that racket gives. So quickly moving on, you see the same thing happen in other sports. You've got a Rover safety bicycle on the left, you've got Eddie Merckx in the middle, and you've got Chris Boardman on the right. And you can see the evolution of those bikes, primarily through good design, but also on the right-hand side, some new materials appearing, carbon fiber materials starting to appear in the frame. Reaching the modern day, the kind of things we can do now, because we've got good computational technology. This is a computational wind tunnel. It's called computational fluid dynamics. We've scanned our athletes. We've scanned our helmet. We've put a mesh around it. We've put some airflow around the outside. And we've created our computational wind tunnel. And we can start doing experiments on that and saying, what's the body posture, what kind of helmet should we use? And you'll see at the 2012 Winter Olympics quite an array of different helmets which have been matched to the use of the rider, to the event that they're doing, and to their body posture. So you'll see quite an array of those. So we do aerodynamics, we can do structural dynamics. This is a piece of work we did for Prince tennis rackets. So we've got a computational model of a ball. It's got an air in the middle. It's got a rubber outside. It's got a felt around the outside of that. You've got some strings, and you've got the graphite racket. Don't be fooled by the amount of deflection there. It's been enhanced, so you can see all the deflections. So that's the kind of things that we have traditionally done. Over the last 4 years, we've worked with these Olympic partners. Some are winter sports, some are summer sports. And actually, things have changed subtly over the last 4 years, the technologies that we're being asked to develop. And it's not necessarily the equipment side, it's the enabling technologies. So here we've got a system that we've created for British swimming. It's called NEMO. And it's an analysis system where we analyze videos of the swimmers. We look at stroke rates, we look at distance per stroke, we look at velocity across the pool, and time at key periods. And in that system, we've now got over 1 million pieces of information. We've got 47,000 swims. We've got something like 2,000 athletes across 60 countries. And that's incredibly powerful. It's the information that we have in there which is really, really powerful and allows us to look at performance of athletes and make predictions on strategies for particular events. So we've got similar things for diving. So you can see on the left-hand side, you can see the boss in the middle. We've got Adam Sutherland, who's the coach. And what we've got here is we've got a calibrated camera system at a diving pool next to the 3-meter springboard. The system is calibrated. The coach is able to take an immediate video. And by the time the diver gets out the pool, he's annotated it, it's on an iPad, and it's sent to his iPod so that when he goes home, he's got all this information ready to take as the lesson for that particular coaching period. So that's the way things are going. Let's see if I can get this to move forward. Okay, we've got another one for boxing here. This is in the elite boxing gym in Sheffield, which is where they're based. Slightly fat, they don't really box that fast. And Okay, very simple looking piece of software which has evolved, but we're starting to do pretty clever things, starting to look at the patterns that the boxers make across the ring. There's certain strategies that you follow to win the bout, a certain number of punches per minute that you've got to throw, and successful punches, because it's the successful punches that make you win the gold. So we're starting to take lots of information and analyze it, and using fairly complex mathematical procedures to do that. So just finishing off, I'll just touch on where I think it's going. So you might recognize this thing on the top. It's an Xbox. It's an Xbox Kinect, sorry. It's actually a depth camera. So it's a gaming console, sits on top of your TV, and you wave at it, and you can play tennis and do all sorts of things. Okay. Inside that is a 3D depth camera. Now, we, as in sports science, we use very complex labs, which cost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds. This thing costs about $100. And what you can do with that is absolutely astounding. So this is a scan using an Xbox Kinect of a real person. This is their torso. And what we've got there is we've got a point cloud, a three-dimensional point cloud. So that's what the Xbox Kinect actually does. It sprays out some infrared and has a camera that picks that up, and it works out the depth. It's really, really clever. Once you've got things like that, you can take measurements of shape. So we could use that if we wanted to recreate our athlete in our wind tunnel. But you can also do some other things. You might not be able to see that, but this is the Xbox Kinect view. This is the video view. You might just be able to see a skeleton which has been drawn on top of that. So this thing here has got a skeleton with joint angles and posture of this person here. Now, it's only cost $100, so you wouldn't expect it to be quite as good as a £100,000 machine, and it's not. But it's flipping good. And these things are going to start appearing on mobile phones before too long. So before too long, we're going to have mobile systems which we'll be able to take out into the field to measure our athletes doing various things, which is one of those things, the holy grail for sports engineers. And what's really nice is those technologies will also appear as apps for the likes of you and I. So just going back to the future, we should remember that at the end of the ancient Olympic Games, there were 300 ancient Olympic Games. And if we had as many Olympic Games as they had then, we'd get to the year 3000. So when they got to their equivalent of the year 3000, they had chariot racing. And here's a picture of Ben-Hur, if you've ever seen that film. Quite a faithful depiction of a chariot race, apparently. This is the equivalent of having Formula One in your Olympic Games. So one question I'll leave you with, perhaps, is what kind of sports do we expect to see in the year 3000? And I'll just leave you with a picture with the guys, some of the guys that work for me, because I don't do any of the work anymore. They do it all, and I just get to stand up in front of you guys. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Again, Vicky, if you wanted to go up.
I think you're picking me up okay from the microphone. I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me tonight, and really to get my 10 minutes up and running, I'd really like to just invite you to my bubble and my life, and if this works. So hopefully you can join me to the world of the Paralympics, and for my talk, just very briefly now, I'd just like to sort of focus really on the wheelchair athlete. So you've seen an array of athletes there with physical impairments. Technology is there. I'm in the back room, and I've been providing sports science support now since 1994 with the Paralympic athletes, and had the pleasure to travel to many of these particular prominent activities with them. But in terms of my life, then I look at this particular picture here, where I have a wheelchair athlete. And the question that I'm always posing myself is, can I use the able-bodied training theory to improve the performances of that wheelchair athlete? Can I use the same coaching strategy? Can I use the same training loads in terms of the physiology, the support, the volume of training that these athletes can undertake? And how do I use the cycling literature to make that wheelchair go the fastest? And it's really encompassing what's known and moving forward the Paralympic athlete, because the life of the Paralympic athlete in terms of Paralympic Games started in 1948. So again, it's even younger than that of the Olympics. But if I look to improve performance, what do? I take what I describe as an interdisciplinary approach by saying, here's the athlete, part A. I then say, well, let's look at the wheelchair. What's the mechanics of that wheelchair? But what's most important in the model and the approach that I take is the interaction between the athlete and the wheelchair in their environment. And that's really then the interfacing of the wheelchair user combination. If we look at that and we sort of say, well, how has the sport advanced? Then there has been considerable improvements in performance of wheelchair athletes. And if we look at an athletic performance, because that's done by distance and time, then we can see that the marathon record has halved since 1977, where we've actually got a recorded marathon race, sort of 2 hours and 40, and in 2004, that was smashed to 1 hour and 18 minutes and 27 seconds for that distance. But where has that performance come from? We've got advances in wheelchair design. If I show you the slide here, where you've got your four-wheeled sort of racing chair moving to 3 wheels, and then the quite longer chair there. I have got some work that, again, we're doing with partners with UK Sport, but I guess it's top secret until the opening ceremony, where we've done work with wheelchair, wind tunnels, and chair configurations. But is it just the technology? I would say, and perhaps the next little overview about technology and sort of physiology, etc., is that we also have improved athletic training regimes. We can push athletes harder, but we must think that we're just training the upper body of a wheelchair athlete, and that obviously is a key factor from my point of view as well. If we turn to wheelchair basketball, then the sport back in 1948 was NHS wheelchairs. Very heavy, very cumbersome. We move along the time to see a bit more camber with the wheelchair, a lot lighter. We have titanium chairs. And just a little bit of science, if we look at the metabolic cost, so that's sort of the energy utilised, then those chairs in 1960 were up here. Very uneconomical with pushing around a basketball court. And we move then down towards here, the 1980s and 2000. Again, the 2012 chair has yet to be tested, and actually we're testing the final prototype tomorrow with the athletes who've been training with that for London. So research, the science, we look at the chair design, we look at the push strategy of the athlete to try and optimize the two and improve performance. We also must consider the impairment. I'm not expecting you all to be experts in the world of Paralympic sport in the audience this evening, but we have people that have different impairments in terms of trunk stability and also loss of limbs who play wheelchair sports. And so you might have your goalkeeper, your defensive player in soccer. In wheelchair rugby, as an example, we have defensive athletes who use defensive wheelchairs, which are longer so they don't get pushed around on the court. And then we have an offensive chair that's a lot shorter, more agile, that's suited for different athletes to get around the court quicker. So there's a number of things that we must consider for the Paralympic athletes. Just a little bit of context, for a game of wheelchair basketball, a coach can play 14 points on the basketball court. That's made up by the athlete's physical capabilities. So if an athlete gets injured and they're a 2.5-pointer, it's not as simple as looking at your bench and putting on the sub. You've got to look on your bench, look at the system of play, maybe take off another 2.5-pointer and put on a 4-point pointer and a 1-point pointer. But then your system of plays change because your 4-point player is an amputee. Your 1-point play is someone who's broken their neck quite high up and therefore has less stability. So there's a number of things that we must consider in terms of Paralympic performance and technology. So very quickly, I'm just, again, putting in my world, and what I was trying to do here is to say, well, how do we investigate some of these features? How do we know which wheelchair is the best for the athlete? How do we look at the physical capabilities of the athletes? We go to a laboratory. That's the ideal starting place because that is a controlled environment. We can look at cause and effect. So we have an athlete on the treadmill here. They've got motion markers placed on them to look at the technique. They're in a wheelchair. We change the wheel size. We look at their responses in controlled environments. We look at the physiology of the athlete, how economical they are pushing the wheelchair. Measures as oxygen uptake, heart rate, looking at rating of perceived exertion. Just like filling your car with petrol to see which is the most economical, whizzing down the motorway on the M1. Endurance is a key factor for performance on the court for wheelchair basketball and rugby. Fatigue can also be a limiting factor. And so we need to understand these models of the athletes. If we move quickly on to the technique side of things, optimizing the man-machine, we do kinematic analysis. We've spoken about some things of Xboxes and how they can map and monitor our movements. But again, in a laboratory, we can look at the push technique and try and optimize the models. What's interesting, and maybe in our discussion, we might talk about the risk of injuries, pushing athletes to the boundaries. Imagine pushing a wheelchair for your daily activities and then pushing a wheelchair for sport. That's going to cause a considerable amount of overuse, and you've got your transfer of daily tasks in and out of your car at the same time. There's not really a respite for the wheelchair athlete. That said, what we've done is taken a clinical tool, which is actually a smart wheel, which looks at the hand-rim forces of the athlete. We want to see what technique is the best one for reducing any risk of injuries in the wrist and the shoulder. So possibly we can use these techniques to provide an insight into injury risk. And I'll leave that point for some discussion. Athletes don't always like coming to the laboratory. We must be seen in their environment. So we must try and replicate what we can from a lab to a field-based setting. That's their environment. So we must look at the athlete playing wheelchair basketball, understand the sports, and then we can tease out acceleration, sprinting, maneuverability, braking, and backwards pulling, which is a small component but uses different muscles. So we look at timing gates, and we look at the sort of field testing in the environment. And then finally, we then take all this data and look what's best for them. So the final point I leave you with is that not only are we pushing the bodies, the understanding of the wheelchair, is that we're also using assistive technology to improve the detailed information that we're giving the performer in a scientific way. And we have developed, with engineers, what we call a velocimeter that allows us to look at the profiles of on-court maneuverability. So we can look at how an athlete pushes, what distance they cover, and how we can optimize that with strength and conditioning. And what I must stress to end with is really working in partnership with the coach, the athlete, and the scientist, and looking at it as the big picture. I've had some very memorable experiences, and I guess the video that I started with gives me goosebumps, and I'm hoping to sort of share the future with you in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sanjay Sharma, and I'm a professor of cardiology. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about screening young athletes for cardiac disease, and I believe this is pertinent in light of some of the events that have taken place. I feel I'm in a position to do this because I've been working with athletes for many, many years. I'm the medical director for the London Marathon. I'm also the cardiologist for the 2012 Olympics, and I'm a cardiology advisor to the Rugby Union, Rugby League, and the Lawn Tennis Association. Now, the benefits of exercise on the cardiovascular system are extremely well established. We know that people who exercise have better blood pressure profiles and lipid profiles. Exercise curbs obesity, and by doing that, it prevents the onset of premature diabetes mellitus. By reducing these risk factors for coronary atherosclerosis, exercise promotes longevity of life, and people that exercise regularly live an average of 7 years longer than those who are sedentary. Apart from the benefits on the cardiovascular system, it is well established that exercise reduces the risk of certain cancers such as carcinoma of the prostate and may be beneficial in reducing the risk of dementia. We know that exercise promotes physical conditioning and stamina, but it also promotes mental strength. So I think everybody in this room would agree that young athletes epitomize the healthiest segment of our society. These young individuals are capable of extraordinary physical activity and are a source of inspiration and aspiration for our youth. And just like in Vicky's case, this video often gives me goosebumps. I'm going to take you back to Athens in 2004 just to demonstrate what Dame Kelly Holmes did that day and what that did for Great Britain. And you only have to listen to Steve Cram's commentary as things go on, just to give you some idea of the joy that these athletes bring to us. It always has the same effects on me. I'm sure some of you have got goose pimples right now. Well, we've just seen what an athlete's capable of, but every now and then, a young, unsuspecting athlete may die suddenly during competition. I'm going to take you back to 2003 during the FIFA Federations Cup when Cameroon played Colombia, and this young man is breathing his last. And what I want you all to notice is that there are several sports individuals around him, physiotherapists, and maybe even doctors. But nobody has attempted to feel his pulse, and nobody has initiated cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Now, I am not in any way criticizing these medics, but this is the view that people normally have, that these young individuals are invincible, and they can't possibly die. So the rest of this becomes very disturbing, so I will stop just there. Okay. These deaths, of course, are highly publicized by the media. They draw attention to the youth of the individual, the counterintuitive nature of the event, and the potential number of life years lost. Probably the latest vision in our memory was Fabrice Muamba, who collapsed at White Hart Lane when Bolton played Spurs and died for 78 minutes before being resuscitated and is now almost back to normal. We've had a spate of deaths in sports cardiology. This is Pier Mario Morosini that died in Italy. Alexander Dale Owen would have competed in this year's Olympics had he not died. And then, of course, we had Nesic, a Serbian rower who died, who would have competed in this year's Olympics. So deaths do occur. The incidence, I'm pleased to report, is rare, only 1 in 50,000, but it's important to remember that 40% occur in individuals aged under 18. They're much more common in males than females. 90% occur during or immediately after exertion, and the vast majority are due to structural and electrical cardiac disorders that are either inherited or congenital, of which about 80% can be identified during life. Sadly, sudden death is the first presentation in 80%, so we cannot use health questionnaires to identify those at risk because most athletes don't have
any abnormal findings. So we've got to perform some form of simple investigation, and that may be an ECG. This graph demonstrates death rates in athletes in the red bars and non-athletes in the yellow bars over about a 28-year period. In Italy, screening is mandated. Anybody that participates in competitive sport has to have an annual medical comprising of history, examination, and 12-lead ECG. These are the death rates in athletes just before screening, around 3.6 per 100,000. Death rates in non-athletes, about 0.9 per 100,000. The first point I want to make is that those individuals that harbour serious cardiac conditions are 3 to 5 times more likely to die if they exercise regularly than if they led a sedentary lifestyle. But with the screening with ECG, these people have identified numerous individuals, disqualified those with sinister conditions, such that now death rates in sportsmen in Italy are only 0.4 per 100,000. That represents a 90% reduction in sudden death with ECG. In the United Kingdom, the Lawn Tennis Association, the Football Association, Rugby Union, and recently the English Institute of Sport advocate and implement screening of athletes, but I believe that this screening should not be confined to the highest echelons of sport. There are so many grassroots sports and individuals who train extremely hard that are not offered this type of screening. And perhaps one of the reasons, apart from cost, the main Achilles heel is the false positive rate with ECGs. If you read the data on ECGs, you may find that some studies suggest that 10 to 20% of athletes have ECG changes that would lead to false positive results, which results in unnecessary investigations and even maybe false disqualification. And that's because if you're an individual that has to pump 30 litres of blood around the body for 20 to 30 hours a week, your heart has to enlarge. Now, the electrical, structural and functional manifestations of this physiological cardiac enlargement can sometimes overlap with conditions that may predispose to sudden cardiac death, notably this disorder called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is the commonest cause of death in young athletes and is characterized with bizarre ECG changes and a thickened heart muscle. So what do I do when I'm dealing with a male athlete with a slightly thickened heart muscle with a bizarre ECG? Of course, it's very important for me to call the right shots, to differentiate between physiology and pathology, since an erroneous diagnosis has the potential for very serious consequences. If I diagnose erroneously athlete's heart in a young individual with cardiomyopathy, I may jeopardize a young life. Conversely, if I falsely diagnosed a cardiomyopathy in an athlete, I've cost that individual physically, psychologically, and even financially. So what my research has involved since 1996 is to study the hearts in detail. I worked with a charity organisation called Cardiac Risk in the Young, which was founded in 1996, and we first started targeting adolescent and young athletes because the UK do not have a nationally sponsored screening programme. We started with the Lawn Tennis Association, which was the first organisation that started screening, then football, then we started screening random sporting disciplines, and in 2001 our screening programme became much more organised, and we started involving schools and general population. And this programme involved 12-lead ECG, which is a simple cardiac tracing looking at electrical faults of the heart that can only be picked up during life, and in some cases echocardiography to identify structural abnormalities of the heart. This is a typical athlete's heart showing large QRS spikes and a slow heartbeat and a big heart. What I found, and this is something that you may be interested in, is that 1 in 100 athletes harbour a mild structural abnormality that may be made worse with athletic activity and may create problems in midlife. But more worrying is the fact that 1 in 300 athletes in the UK harbour a cardiac problem that could potentially kill them instantly. Our research findings also identified a spectrum of normal ECG changes in adults and adolescents, reported upper limits of structural changes in the heart in young athletes, and methods of differentiating cardiac disease from those implicated in sudden death. So we've gone a long way in reducing false positive rate, and our papers, for those of you that are interested, I can give you copies of some of these. We've had numerous publications in the last few years, numerous firsts in sport cardiology. What we've identified is that people who are participating in endurance sports, such as cycling, rowing and running, males who are large are the most likely to have bizarre ECG changes and thickened hearts. And that brings me to ethnicity as well. We find that black athletes are going to make up 20% of the GB squad. They have broken numerous world records. 25% of these individuals have a bizarre ECG that would normally be reported as abnormal if you used Caucasian data. 20% of these individuals have a left ventricular wall thickness that can overlap with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. The upper limit of hypertrophy is 12 millimeters in URI. About 3% of white athletes have a value above that, but nearly 20% of black athletes fall in that range. So these people could be basically discriminated against if we used white data. But based on our research, what we've found, the good news, apart from saying that 1% have minor abnormalities, 0.3% have serious abnormalities, we brought the false positive rate down from 16 to 20% all the way down to 3%. So making screening in athletes a more palatable and practical approach. Our exhibit upstairs, for those of you that are interested, is demonstrating the benefits of exercise. I think everyone should exercise. It's the most palatable thing that we can ever give our patients as doctors. It has more benefits and less side effects than anything I can ever imagine. And it's free. It will demonstrate physiological changes that occur within the heart in response to exercise. The manifestations of such changes on the 12-lead ECG and echo, you could practice these on yourself if you wish. And it will provide the role of ECG and echo in screening athletes, and we'll give you some idea of the test that our GB squad, the test that they went through. In fact, you can have some of these as well upstairs between now and Sunday at 6 o'clock. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed those talks. They were very interesting, and we'd like to now start our discussion. So we want to start with the use of technology in sport. Why are we using it? When are we using it? And should we really be using technology in sport? So I'm going to start with you.
Oh, that's my go, is it?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Sorry, there was 3 questions there.
Yeah, so maybe, should we be using technology in sport?
Well, I'm going to say yes, aren't I, because it's my job. So, should we use technology in sport? Okay. It's a big question. Okay, where do I start? The rules of sport allow you to use technologies. It's inherent in the sporting rules, in the lexicon of what they say, that you can use technologies. Sometimes it says you can't use certain technologies. So the rules of, say, the javelin, let's look at that. They specify very specifically the size and shape and mass of the javelin. So in terms of what you can do to that javelin, people tried various things over the years. They tried roughening up the tail. They tried hollowing it out. They tried all sorts of things to improve the performance because people thought, I can change the design. But the ruling bodies said, OK, we want to make a limit on that because we prefer that our sport is dominated by the athlete and we want everyone to use virtually the same javelin. If you look at pole vaults, there's certain rules which say you can put something on the end. That sits in the box, but it can be as long as you want and you can make it out of whatever you like. So you've seen pole vaults change over the years from starting out with a solid hickory pole to bamboo. Hollow out the inside. You don't need the inside. If you've got any engineers in here, you don't need the material down the neutral axis because it doesn't have any load-bearing or stress-bearing characteristics. So then we went to metal poles, and then we've gone to carbon fiber poles. You've seen heights increase accordingly. So in that sport, they've said, do you know, we quite like the technology or the new materials. It keeps our sport alive. It keeps us having world records and so on. So it depends upon what the rules say, and as a sports engineer, the first thing we do when someone comes to ask us to help them develop something is we look at the rules of the sport, and we go, okay, what can you do, what can't you do? Sometimes we do look at some wacky things. We go, well, okay, how far can we push it that we know's illegal in terms of the sporting rules? They're never illegal in a court of law. It's just in the sporting court of arbitration. So after that, we then go, okay, here's the rules. We'll develop this. It sits inside because it's not in our interest to develop anything that's going to get banned anyway.
Yeah. So talking of the limitations that you have, that you put on and the rules that you put on the development of this technology. Have you found anything like that when you're developing your wheelchair technology for your Paralympic athletes? Because we could see from your presentation you're very creative in terms of structure and shape depending on the position that the player or the athlete does in the sport. Do you find the same limitations?
I mean, from a Paralympic point of view, I think for all sports, but it's more clearly evident in Paralympics, is that we have to take this individualistic approach. And obviously that's driven by the functional capabilities of the athletes that I work with. Again, it goes back to rules, because if I'm with wheelchair basketball, the first port of play is classification of the athlete, a bench test in terms of trunk stability and what the physical impairment is. But then secondly, the athlete's in the chair, and the chair gets a check in terms of height, regulations, dimensions. So again, if I'm looking to develop and evolve the sport's performance, I've got to go back to basics to think, well, what's the athlete capable of? How can we put them in the chair? And what room have we got to change the chair with in terms of the rules? What's interesting, though, just taking a slightly different slant, though, is in terms of Paralympic sport, it's gone a long way, but there's still, in terms of the Paralympic movement of the International Paralympic Committee, and I'm throwing this back now to others here, is almost along the lines of, we've had big investors leading into London 2012, we've got funds. With wheelchairs, they cost a lot of money, and there has been some people in the Paralympic movement that says maybe that's not fair, because there's still some countries that can't afford the wheelchairs that we have, and so it's excluding them from participation at the Paralympic level. Now that's perhaps above and beyond my area of expertise, and I hold comment on whether it's right or wrong, but it's an interesting one in terms of we have had a big investment with London 2012 with technology and perhaps with innovation and what we can do.
Yeah, well, we wanted to have a look at whether or not these technologies that we mentioned, you said that there's sometimes the technology develops with the sport, and sometimes the sport develops with the technology. So in terms of technology that's used maybe with the cardiovascular stuff, have you found that the technology developed has influenced any other parts of medicine, or have there been parts of your particular area of research that have helped with the developments in the sport?
Well, I think we should really go back to what we've got available. I mean, the ECG's been around since the early 50s, in the 40s even. Echocardiography, that's cardiac ultrasound, has also been around, but improvement in tissue harmonics have basically revolutionized the specification with how we look at heart muscle. We can now identify heart muscle problems much more easily than we used to be able to. We can look at the right ventricle in more detail. The advent of cardiac magnetic resonance scanning also demonstrates scar tissue, which an echocardiogram can't. There has been a spate of studies, and I would say to all of you that they're probably premature and slightly scaremongery, that may tell you that if you run lots of marathons, you may damage your ventricles and may develop scar tissue because the human being wasn't supposed to run 20 marathons a year. That data is not been proven in a large cohort, but what cardiac MRI has established is that those people that run 30 or 40 marathons in a lifetime have a much higher prevalence of scar tissue within the heart muscle, suggesting that in some predisposed individuals, too much exercise, dare I say it, may be bad for you.
We won't go
Getting me
into
worried
that.
now.
Oh, no, I'm not talking about kicking the ball around the park. I'm talking about over 100 marathons in a lifetime.
I've done that one. Okay.
That's a lot of sport to do. In terms of over-exercising in any particular sport, have you found that there's a limitation, like a lower limit? So if you're looking at maybe an amateur athlete who doesn't train as much as an elite athlete, have you found that there's a difference in terms of whether or not the likelihood of them suffering from an event as such?
That's an excellent point. The question I think you're asking is an elite athlete more likely to die suddenly or succumb from some form of fatality versus a recreational? Definitely not. In fact, the paradox is that we screen our top athletes, and just by virtue, by what they've achieved at national ranking, they've probably been selected out. They've selected out disease because they've actually reached that level. It's the grassroots sports who are not tested that are more likely to die. In fact, in the United Kingdom, we see about 600 young deaths between 14 and 35 per annum. That equates to 12 per week. Many of those people dying during exercise. And these aren't the creme de la creme like Fabrice Muamba, who hit the headlines. They only hit small columns in the local gazette.
Talking of only the elite athletes having access to this sort of specialist care, specialist funding and specialist equipment as well, do you think that's slightly unfair? There should be funding available to have it across all levels of sport?
There is in a way. I mean, in terms of a lot of the things that we do distill down to the likes of Adidas, Nike, you know, running shoes, tennis equipment. So there's specialist research for the absolute elite end, and some of those same techniques are used on the pieces of equipment that everyone else uses. But you have to say, you know, if we look at the tennis rackets and the benefits, say, of the wider tennis rackets, there's certain technologies that have gone in there where you can prove in a lab that this racket is better than that racket in a certain way, but actually it's only going to work for the likes of Sampras, Murray, and so on. If I pick it up, it ain't going to make a blind bit of difference, to be honest. Yeah. So we do see the benefits of some of those technologies, but actually, is it going to make a big difference to us? Probably not. You'd be better spending your money on coaching. Yeah,
that's fair enough. We had the same discussion went on when, because my expertise lies in swimming, so when they banned the space-age swimsuits a few years ago after the Olympics, when they started breaking all the records, it was a lot of people were saying, well, is it because some of the other athletes they just don't have access to the technology, they can't get given the technology, so it's unfair to be racing against somebody who has one of these fancy suits and you're still wearing your material suits. They've got that added advantage just because they can afford the extra technology or they've got that extra sponsorship.
I think in terms of screening, we have to be realistic. You know, I'm obviously very pro-screening, but there are 1.5 million people aged 14 to 35 in the United Kingdom who exercise regularly. The government, of course, has got issues with curbing cancer, high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes and heart attacks, and they will utilise most of those funds in these individuals. Now, I'm not saying that that's how it should be, but if we look at the number of deaths we see in 60s and 70-year-olds, there are 120,000 per annum versus only 600 in the youth. So the government's going to spend most of their money in investing in the older population. But I think if we're going to roll something like this out, especially in sporting organisations that aren't financially well endowed, then I think we should stop at health questionnaire, physical examination and a 12-lead ECG. We know that if we did that, we would identify the vast majority. So we may not have the infrastructure to ultrasound every single athlete. We should only probably ultrasound the athletes who've got abnormal ECGs or something that we hear when we listen to their heart. That's the practice that takes place in Italy, and that's what's resulted in a massive reduction in sudden deaths.
Going back to the development of the technologies that are used in sport now, have you found that there's a big advantage with working with the athletes, especially with the disability athletes? You say I can imagine you do a lot of personalisation in terms of the shape and the technology and the design of your wheelchairs. Yeah. So you get a lot of benefit with working with individual athletes.
Yeah, definitely. Well. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a two-way process, I think, with development of anything. I'm using the Paralympic model, but it falls in the able-bodied world, is that I've got a son who's 10 and he's been watching the football, and now he wants the Nike boots that are white and green because they're scoring goals. And it's the same thing with the athletes. So the London Marathon, there's a guy who's got 14-inch hand rims. A young up-and-coming athlete will want that size hand rims. They'll come to me and use them, and we got to use the evidence-based practice to then sort of say to them, well, there's a subjective element in it at the same time as the research process, but it's balancing out the psychology of the technology and your equipment with also what fits and works best for you as an individual, and it's just that balancing act, I think. But I think we can learn a lot through athletes themselves, and I take very much the model of I do work with elite athletes, but I'm disseminating my knowledge to development athletes, because if I've got a good baseline to work with, I can then say, well, 16-degree camber with this size wheel works up here. Let's start with that and then change from that, rather than start from a blank bit of paper. And it's how you utilise the knowledge across and up the exercise spectrum, I think.
Yeah. Working with athletes, and you did a lot of, I read your recent article in the physics world. You've worked a lot with a lot of past data, and looked at varying sports. Have you found that when people started developing more technologies and started working more with the athletes, did you find there was a bigger jump in terms of an improvement in their athletic abilities, capabilities, in terms of times being broken?
Yeah, it's interesting. We looked at we looked at data going back to the 1890s, which is when records really started to appear, and we looked at men and women, all track and field, and we looked at the top 25 in every year. And if you do that and take an average, you can get to see what things will affect the sport, and you get to see the downs as well as the ups. And there's certain things that you see in all the data. One thing is that performance is all leveling off. So in all sports, performance is leveling off. Certain sports leveling off more than others. So some of the middle distance running events have certainly leveled off. 100-meter sprint, there's still some way to go. So although we kind of think, oh, we must be at the limits, no, we're not at the limits at all. So I asked my PhD student, I said to him, okay, right, see if you can prove to me that technology actually makes a difference in sport. Go and look at the data and prove to me that it does or it doesn't. And some of the things that jumped out to us were quite interesting. So the first thing that we saw which proved that technology makes a difference was not the one we expected, which was the introduction of fully automated timing in the 1970s. So in the 1970s, running performance suddenly just got a lot worse by 0.2 of a second. And you can see that in the data, you can see this massive step. And that's because simply the reaction time for the person running the stopwatch used to be taken off their time. It was about 0.2 of a second. And once you got electronic timing, you got much better, more accurate measurement of the time. So actually everyone got worse. So that was the first thing that we saw. So, oh, damn, okay, that's not what we expected. So then you start to look for other things. You can see the swimsuit data. You know, we talked about swimsuits already. That is very evident in the data. So you can see that the 2000 swimsuits made a difference. The 2008 swimsuits made a difference, the ones with the polyurethane panels in the sides. And then we had these rather, I'm not sure what the word is, these plastic bag swimsuits, these polyurethane ones that people took 45 minutes to get into. And those made a big difference. So, you know, if I was going to say in terms of percent, the 2000 swimsuits, the kind of full-length bodysuits would probably make a difference of about 5%. The 2008 swimsuit would probably make another 5%, and then the polyurethane suits another 2%. So these are all cumulative. What's interesting is what we also saw in the 70s was another uptake of technologies, which was goggles, hats, and people shaving their hair. And that had a difference which is at least as big as the swimsuit difference. So in 2010, we saw the swimsuits banned, and we saw a rapid drop in performance, and that's about 6% drop. Didn't come down quite so much because performances are always going up. So we can see how technologies do and don't affect sport just by looking at the data. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to now open up questions to the floor if anybody has any questions for our speakers. Yes, sorry, just to say, if you wait for the microphone to come to you and then stand up.
Hi. This is a very simple question. I'm not a science person, so it's very uncomplicated. What I wanted to know is, I mean, I was reading about like all these space technologies that, I mean, benefited the society a lot because, I mean, they did a lot of research like which was specific to like astronauts, but eventually that was applied, I mean, for the general benefit of the society. So all the research that's been gone into this, which has been very specific, has it in any way led to, you know, some breakthrough or something which can be applied on a more general basis? Like, for instance, like the research into wheelchairs for the Paralympic athletes? Like, has it led to general improvement in the design of wheelchairs for disabled people and to make them more comfortable? So a very general question.
I mean, certainly a lot of my research, like I've stressed, is with the elite athlete, but there is the public health agenda as well, and I feel that getting more people physically fit by using a wheelchair is being disseminated down. I mean, I actually work with athletes who are ambulant, clubfoot, loss of a limb, and they wouldn't actually be able to engage in the running game of basketball, but they've elected to play wheelchair basketball. And certainly if you look at their training diaries and their lifestyle, they're then doing more physical activity by playing wheelchair basketball than what they would be able to. So it's like an enabling technology, which the way that I see it is that if people choose to play wheelchair sport because they can't play a running version of the sport, then that's got to be a good thing for society in terms of exercise, because it's going back to this sort of exercise is medicine scenario. And I certainly liaise with wheelchair manufacturers to sort of disseminate my information to the public in terms of seating, posture, trying to reduce pressure sores and things like that. So there is an ongoing exchange at an elite level to NHS in the world of wheelchairs. So I guess we are sharing that knowledge.
Yeah. I'll give you a couple of examples of things. We've talked about tennis and the advent of the graphite rackets. What happened there? They became much larger, and because they became larger, all the weight was around the edge of the racket, and what that did is that increased the moment of inertia of the racket, so that made it more resistant to spinning in your hand if you had an off-center hit. So if you've ever tried to play with a wooden racket, it's really, really difficult. I can remember kind of playing tennis, and it would be an hour before we got a rally going. But now these rackets make it much, much easier to play. So one of the things about equipment nowadays is that they do make the sport easier to get into, and I think that's really important. So that's certainly one in tennis. And then in terms of the health agenda, we've talked about the Kinect work. And body scanning is quite important in health as well as in sport, and that's led directly to some work that we're doing with a breast surgeon, which is looking at the aesthetics of breast reconstruction, which is a big issue. 1 in 10 breast reconstructions have to be redone because the female is not happy with the outcome. And understanding what she's not happy about is an important thing, because 1 in 10 is an awful lot of operations that should be kind of unnecessary.
Are there any other questions? Please go, the lady in the short hair.
I've read once that apparently selenium has a lot to do with keeping the heart of the muscle strong. Is there anything you think to do with bad nutrition and people falling dead?
That's a good question. The first point that you allude to, that selenium deficiency can affect the heart, is absolutely correct. There is a link between selenium deficiency and something called dilated cardiomyopathy, whereby the heart muscle just doesn't contract very well, so the heart's enlarged, it's baggy, and doesn't work very well. When we look at athletes, we don't see that in our athletes. In fact, we do see athletes, if we scan them, especially the very, very fit ones, that it appears that their heart may not be working very well because the heart's so large, it's only beating at 30 beats per minute, and it's very big, so it sometimes simulates a diseased heart. But we can easily tell very quickly whether that's a diseased heart or not by just putting them on the treadmill and scanning their heart as they're exercising, and you find that this thing that's doing this suddenly wakes up and starts beating very well. So in terms of trace elements such as selenium deficiency, we've not come across athletes dying from those types of trace elements. Whenever we see deaths in athletes, they are usually related to inherited structural or electrical faults of the heart. In small number of cases, we don't find anything, and that really begs the question, are some of these performance-enhancing medications or drugs that we cannot detect, are they having their toll on the individual, or are or are some people just pushing themselves to a limit whereby in some predisposed individual extreme stress on the heart may culminate in a fatal rhythm disturbance.
I just wondered what your thoughts were on the crossover between disability athletes and non-disability athletes, specifically thinking about Oscar Pistorius being allowed to compete with non-disabled athletes, and is that fair, and who's it fair for?
I guess I rehearsed my answer for that question and showed a slight video of him running. From my perspective, my quick answer actually, I don't feel there's enough evidence out there at the moment. How the IPC and the IOC have looked at the story of the Blade Runner Oscar from South Africa is he is allowed to, but no other amputee at this moment in time is. So the sort of ruling means that he can, but others can't at this moment in time. But what's interesting is how he went through the process of gathering research to enable him to compete against other Olympic athletes was actually based on cycling tests. So the physiology of him in terms of his physical capacity as an amputee was based on a cycling test, but yet he runs. It was also based on a straight line sprint as opposed to running around bends for his 400 or 200. So it's quite an amazing story, really, in terms of how it's all evolved. Part of me sort of thinks that maybe I don't think it should happen because he is using assistive technology for that event. Whereas if you have a blind runner, then they're not using assisted technology. If, you know, the swimmers leave their limbs on the side of the pool and jump in and may have a hand missing and things like this. And so I actually don't think perhaps it should take place, but it's an interesting, but only on the point of the fact that I don't think there's enough evidence to rule it in or out at this moment in time. I mean, I don't know what you think, Steve.
I think of what some of the discussions I have with quite young school children who talk about at school about what is a fair test. So this is the kind of lesson that a lot of school kids do and talk about. So is it a fair test to have someone like Oscar Pistorius running against a non-disabled athlete? And probably I might reverse it, actually, is say he got to the 400 metres final and was to win the final, what would the discussion then be? And I think the discussion then would be the other way around, and people would be saying, he's won it because of the assistive technology. And so I don't think it's right for us to say, yes, you can take part in the 400 metres, but just don't win it. Okay, and that's where I think, when I've gone through that thought process, I think, no, I think probably it's not the right thing.
Any more questions?
I heard of a study of young tennis players who were training very hard to become better tennis players, the teenagers and younger, and I don't know how many of them, but many had changes in their bodies that would cause very severe problems in later life. Is there anything that technology is doing to overcome that problem for young athletes who are working very hard to not be trading away their later life for short-term gain?
I think I'll talk about it from the equipment point of view, and then I'll let the medical experts perhaps talk about from the medicine side. In terms of tennis, the way the International Tennis Federation has looked at this is to say, well, how are we teaching our young athletes, our young tennis players, and what kind of equipment are they using at these young ages? So they've put in all sorts of games and rules. I don't know if you've seen, there's these new tennis balls that are out there. So they've actually brought some rules in saying, look, you know, if we're going to have tournaments with younger kids, what we want is we want them to be using equipment that's specific for them. So there's a whole range of balls which start in kind of spongy type balls, and then there's an orange one which is quite soft, and there's an orange and green one which is, I think some of them are even a bit bigger. And it just means that the shock to the arm, it means that the amount of running they have to do to get to the ball is a bit less. So it's trying to reduce the impact on those players and actually increase the enjoyment of that game. So now that's not to say that you're not going to get the absolute professional ones just abusing themselves and doing, you know, getting overuse injuries. That always happens, tennis elbow. And there's nothing you can do about that, because that's about a personal decision to do that. So in terms of the technology, there's certain things they've tried to do. They've tried to bring in appropriate style of games, and certainly some of the manufacturers have tried to bring in equipment which is of appropriate size and weight for youngsters. From a medical point of view, I'll pass that one on.
I can only talk about the heart, and can tell you that tennis players get a 10 to 20% increase in the thickness of their heart muscle, and about a 10% increase in the cavity chamber, and that reverses after six weeks of detraining. As soon as they detrain for 6 weeks, it all goes back to normal. So I'd like to think that any cardiac changes that occur in tennis players are physiological, and they've been shown to be entirely reversible.
Are there any more questions? Yeah.
Would the panel like to do some future gazing and say where they think technology will lead sports over the next, say, 10 to 15 years?
Okay, shall I start that one? Okay, right. I'm just thinking of an answer. So, from my point of view, the 80s was a bit of a materials revolution. We saw new materials appearing. Certainly carbon fiber was the material of choice. So you saw tennis rackets, shoes, bikes, boats, all being used by these lightweight materials. So there was a bit of a materials revolution, and that's kind of coming to an end now. There's a few little benefits you can get. There's coatings, which might continue to give advances, water repellent coatings that might allow you to perform better in rainy conditions, stop mud sticking to you, reduce your weight if you're a cross-country runner or on a downhill mountain biker. From my point of view, the real step change has been in the mobile technologies over the last 3 years. You know, 4 years ago, we weren't doing anything in that area. And I've gone from 0 staff working in that area to 5 staff working in that area in the last 3 years. And we've just quadrupled the amount of work we're doing for next year already. And we're working on Winter Olympics and Commonwealths and Brazil. So in terms of things that are making a difference to us, it's the computational technologies. So we're taking on programmers, mathematicians, we're taking on people that can create systems, hardware and software systems by the side of a pool, by the side of a track, that can create iApps. So we're creating iPhone apps at the moment that you can buy off the App Store. So to me, that's where I see our efforts going. It's not to say that some of those structural things aren't still going to go on. And in terms of, again, I might pass this one on, in terms of the biomedical type side, you know, we are working out what the human genome means, working out what DNA characteristics of good athletes are, and someone somewhere will be trying to manipulate that in some way, I'm sure.
My short answer to that one is really just adding to there is that using my job is to get an athlete fit and healthy on a start line in addition to the wheelchair design. And I feel that in the Paralympic world, we're still catching up some of the technology and training physiology of able-bodied counterparts. And so to finish a basketball training session and to download something that's been instrumented to your wheelchair to show you what the load and volume of that training session was, then that's the way that I see things happening in the next 20 to 30 years, because from a physiology point of view, a lot of the wheelchair athletes that I work with, because they have sympathetic innervation to the heart, and what I mean by that is they've got a blunted heart rate response because they haven't got the hormonal responses to exercise, and therefore their heart rate may only be about 120 beats per minute for a full duration of a marathon race, and their resting heart rates is, say, 80. The margin that they train in is quite hard to monitor, and they can't use heart rate training zones. So a different method of quantifying their training is the way that I'm looking to move forward the Paralympic sports knowledge.
In terms of the, I mean, if I'm talking specifically about identifying cardiac diseases, I do believe that the unraveling of the molecular genetics of some of these very rare conditions that may cause sudden death, and that may not be identified on ECG and exercise testing, may be something that becomes much more useful. We may be able to perform widespread genetic testing for most conditions implicated in sudden cardiac death that can't be identified for athletes if they wish to have those tests done. I'm also sure that there will be facilities to actually perform ECG tracings in athletes when they're playing their sport, because most athletes only experience symptoms usually when they're playing their own sport, but never in a laboratory environment. So we can push an athlete as hard as we want on our treadmill, and they say, well, my symptom didn't come on. It only comes on when I'm rowing on the river. And although we can put 24-hour tapes on that only measure 3 leads, there will come a point, I'm sure, which is not far away, we can remotely actually investigate the entire 12-lead ECG from afar when the athlete's training several miles away from us. I'm sure that day's not far.
We had a question down at the front here earlier. Can we microphone?
You worked it out. Sounds like you worked it out what the question was.
We have a microphone down here, please.
Hello, this is to the panel. I think you might probably get in. My question was, is distance a factor? I mean, for athletes doing a longer distance, doing like, say marathons, is their risk higher than athletes doing like a mid-distance?
That's an excellent question. The question I've been asked, for those of you that didn't hear at the back, was, are athletes participating in long distance or endurance events more at risk than those who participate in shorter distances? Our experience has really been that the sort of athletes that die are those that are involved in very explosive start-stop sport, for example, football and basketball. And you may say, well, why is that? Because surely football isn't anything like as grueling as a marathon run where a runner comes in at 2 hours and 15. And that takes me back to the point I made earlier, that the sort of people that can run marathons at that speed and row for Great Britain are those people that have been selected out from disease. They have selected themselves out. So we normally see these problems in individuals where a sporting discipline doesn't just rely on stamina, but relies intensely on skill as well. You can have a football player who's very fast for 10 or 15 seconds and then pass the ball on and then move into a space and turn the game round, but not do as much exercise as a top rower. So whenever we see deaths due to things like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, they're confined really to football, basketball and baseball, and not to things like rowing.
There's a question at the front.
Medical question. You're saying that exercise is good for you and it adds about 7 years to your life. I was wondering, for just ordinary person, presumably you can do too much exercise, and I'm just wondering what's the sort of, for average person, what sort of exercise you should do, know at home, or and how long? I think they say 3 times a week, but I'm not too sure on that.
Well, they keep shifting goalposts. The point I want to make for the audience really is that the evidence about exercise being good for someone is based on very modest amounts of exercise, okay? It equates to being able to walk a mile in about 20 minutes. And they want you to exercise at that pace for about 30 minutes 5 days a week. So 5 times a week, if you do 30 minutes like that, you can add on 7 years to your life. So that's a modest amount of exercise. Now, of course, we haven't tested exercise loads exceeding 10 mets. I mean, 10 mets is not a lot for some of the youth here. You and I might find it a little bit tough, but some of these guys do, you know, 10 times that sort of exercise in a week. What we do know, certainly, that the more someone exercises, the more detrimental to their ankles and knees. But we have no evidence to suggest that modest or even severe amounts of exercise damages the heart. So what I do want to get back to people our age, because there are some people our age who haven't exercised a lot, who harbour risk factors for coronary artery disease and are sitting on silent coronary artery disease. We get a wake-up call one morning, we smell the coffee, and we feel, oh, there's a huge belly here, let me start running again. In those sort of people, I would advise that if you're experiencing any form of chest tightness when you run, if you have risk factors, such as if you're a cigarette smoker, have high blood pressure, have high cholesterol, or a strong family history of coronary artery disease, I would go and seek a medical opinion before you start embarking on intensive exercise.
Do you want the question, gentleman in the black t-shirt?
Hi, I was just wondering what the moral implications are of preventing people from competing because of their risk of sudden death or any other complications.
That's a superb question. There is obviously this concern that if screening was ever mandated, you are basically, this is an infringement of rights for a young individual who should be able to take their risks. I mean, when you go skiing, we don't say, oh my God, we say we're jealous because we want to be skiing with you, but the chances of you coming back from a skiing holiday are far less than you dropping dead if you played a game of football. We in the UK don't feel that screening should be mandated. The English Institute of Sport don't mandate screening, but I think in a benevolent society such as us, if we're putting so much money into an athlete's nutrition, the engineering behind success, their kit, the tennis racket that they use, if we're going to put so much money into that, what about the engine that pumps 30 litres of blood around the body? Surely an athlete has the right to know whether they're at risk or not. So I'm not saying let's mandate, but let's not close the doors on our grassroots chaps. There are some of those people that have no symptoms, who are worried, who cannot go to the GP and have a test because it's not available on the NHS. I think we should make this available to every single person who's young, who exercises regularly, but we shouldn't let the government pay for it. We should say, look, if you want it, go there. There are several charity organisations that can do this for £35. That's far cheaper than you and I going out tonight for a couple of beers or buying a pair of football boots, and I think it's well worth investing in.
Any further questions?
Hello. My apologies if this has been asked already, but it was a question with regards to funding in each of your respective departments, how you might see yourselves in 10 years receiving funding for each of your departments with regards to equipment and medicine. It is only a question of professionalism now, and we see footballers dropping dead by accident versus rugby players who might see far greater scrutiny on their own medicine and their intake versus professional footballers. And merely the money behind it. There's very little money for rugby on the professional side in comparison to football, and where you might see your own departments taking receiving money in the future 10 years.
Well, you make a very good point in that there is far less money in rugby than there is in football. The Football Association is able to offer all 96 clubs a screening at the age of 16. Anyone below the Premier League doesn't offer any more screening after the age of 16, but if you're in the Premier League, you're screened every year because most Premier League players are also national players, whichever country they come from, and just because of the fact that they compete at national level or compete in Europe, they have to have a screen within the last 12 months before they can compete. So football has this advantage. In terms of rugby, what we do is we're offering ECG health questionnaire. And we have, I must say, we've got an Inherited Cardiac Diseases and Sport Cardiology Institute at St George's, which runs on a Robin Hood policy. So we charge the Premier League clubs, of course, we will charge them the full whack, but we will use that money then to basically fund some of these sporting organisations that just don't have the money. So we've got a huge fund. We have had many discussions with groups like GE that provide lots and lots of technology. And obviously there's been some real generosity from Philips. We received a grant of 1.5 million a few years ago to make sure that we tested athletes. And I think there's probably something similar coming from GE in the very near future, as well as lots of equipment. So I think people who are involved in technology have been very, very forward thinking about this, and also appreciate that there are some organisations that have more money than the other. I think I use this as a Robin Hood policy, as I said. I take money off the rich because I can afford to, but use that money to help the poor, rather than spend it on a holiday.
Well, I'm going to do what he does now, actually. I like that Robin Hood policy. We're funded slightly differently. So my research centre is self-funded. We get a small amount of money from the university, which pays for PhD students, but everything else comes from the commercial income that we find. So people think that sport is a very rich world, because what you see on TV is mostly football, and it's not. You know, football is rich and footballers are rich, but all the other sports are not that rich. And I'd be interested to know what Vicky's experience is. I should imagine yours is possibly worse than mine, which is you kind of do struggle a bit sometimes to make ends meet. Having said that, we have expanded since I set up the centre, so we've now got a dozen PhDs, we've got 16 staff, we've got 18 MSCs and smattering of interns. So there's about 40 of us now all working in this particular area. So there is money out there, but it's hard work getting it. In 10 years' time, I would like to see that our UK sport funding has continued, because I think we've shown some considerable successes in the last this Olympics we're going to see some considerable success. The last Olympics we saw considerable success in some of the things, and we know how successful it was, even though perhaps some of the secrets we can't quite let out, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, there's not much money in Paralympic sport. I guess the way that I tackle the problem for funding issues is that I'm looking at sports performance and trying to share the knowledge from Olympic to Paralympic. And I'm actually doing work with McLaren Formula One, which obviously has got a lot of money, and they've helped in kind provide some infrastructure for some of our research around technology and wheelchair performance. That said, Loughborough University has taken another agenda which I'm becoming involved with over the next 4 years, which is the term performance health. And it's sharing the knowledge of elite athletes, which I've said earlier, down the exercise continuum. So I've been doing a lot of work about immune function of Paralympic athletes, looking at the extreme training histories of Paralympic sports people to encourage people with disabilities to engage in sport who might be put off because they're actually doing a training load that's wrong to them because they're using able-bodied theory. So it's translating it down to the health agenda, where obviously if you hit the right target, there's money in health. But my research profile is sports performance.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for this evening. But that was a great question to finish on. I'd like to thank our panel for being here this evening. So Professor Steve Haake, Dr. Vicky Tolfrey, and Professor Sanjay Sharma again. So if you'd like to join me, please.